Sometimes you have warning. Other times you are jolted by the impact and there is nothing you can do but try to stay safe. Then, after the winds and rain stop, the fire is out or the water's receded, the hard work begins. This video will introduce you to the resources available from the United Church of Christ to help both churches and church members take some simple steps to lessen losses and to help those impacted recover and rebuild. Minnesota has had 67 federally declared disasters in the 57 years between 1957 and 2014. Some communities are in both flood and tornado zones. Living in Minnesota, it is a good idea to be prepared. Minnesota may be the land of 10,000 lakes and the land of sky blue waters, but some years we want to say enough. And don't forget the wind. Between 1950 and 2012, there have been 1,721 reported tornadoes in Minnesota, resulting in 99 deaths and 1,981 injuries. That is an average of 27 tornadoes each year. On June 17, 2010, a series of tornadoes struck Wadena, Almora, and areas in Freeborn County, causing extensive damage and 3 fatalities. Jean Erkenbrack lost part of her house that day.
I saw a tree down. That was my first indication that the winds had been that severe. Got a couple of more blocks into the west side of Wadena, southwest side of Wadena, and saw people hollering in the streets that there were wires down. So realized that this was bigger than your average windstorm. I realized that the skyline was very different because you could see sky for a long way. Got to the end of 7th and Irving, where I live, and realized that the top part of a house was gone. As I was walking the half a block, 3/4 of a block to my house, there were people walking in the street looking somewhat stunned. There were trees down everywhere, and this was a neighborhood that had very tall, huge pines and beautiful trees. I still grieve the trees in my yard. For the farmers, fields were damaged because they were full of metal. They couldn't plow their fields, and they lost livestock, and they lost buildings that weren't insured, and not just losing your home for them, it was losing their home and their livelihood, and the whole shebang.
Bob Griggs was interim pastor at First Congregational UCC in Wadena at the time of the tornado. He noted that there are no guidelines for the role of the church at the time of a community-wide disaster.
In 2010, when the community experienced an EF4 tornado with winds of up to 170 miles an hour, in response to the tornado, many of our local churches in the conference contacted the church or me to offer prayers, their support. A number of our local churches sent financial contributions to help us, both the church and our members, deal with the consequences of the tornado. But what I found in terms of people in a pastoral ministry, there were people who always needed to tell the story, that telling the story of what happened to them if they lost their home, or a family member lost a home, or where they happened to be when the tornado struck, that the need to tell that story and wanting to tell that story, that need did not go away. The local cemetery, which is a beautiful older cemetery with many shade trees and monuments, it had taken a direct hit by the storm. In certain parts, all the grave markers had been leveled and broken. trees had been destroyed. There were very few trees left of any size, and repairing that, which took time and obviously money, a lot of work, was, I thought, a major aspect of the recovery of the community.
The United Church of Christ has resources to help you prepare in advance to minimize losses and to connect with the emergency response organizations in your communities for help when needed.
I had packed some clothes that were just totally unnecessary, like a beach cover-up. I remember opening that suitcase and just thinking, where was your head?
For members, we have guidebooks and checklists to help you identify what you can easily do to prepare. Go kits if you have to leave home quickly, home kits if you need to shelter in place, and car kits. When a disaster happens, we want to help. The best help at that time is to send money through a known and trusted organization, such as the UCC Disaster Ministries.
People poured in to help. So then having folks able to figure out what kind of help is needed and do that in a useful kind of way is a challenge. Otherwise, volunteers end up standing around and not knowing what to do.
While digging out from the disaster, the local community does not have the time or resources to manage volunteers not connected to an organization, or contributions of clothes, toys, household items, food that may not be needed. Wait until there are specific requests. Response and recovery have to follow a timeline. Preparedness is up to you. UCC Disaster Ministries has tools and volunteers available to help you. After a disaster, local, state, and federal agencies are the first to respond, along with key volunteer partners such as the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. When everyone is safe and accounted for, other groups start the cleanup needed before the rebuild can start and work with the families and businesses to provide the support needed. After the event has moved from the front pages in the news, the long-term work of helping the families and community rebuild begins. That is where the UCC and other groups come in.
How long it takes to recover was a surprise. I still have a room that I haven't completed. It's a long, long recovery.
Help is often needed long after a disaster, or sometimes because life deals a bad hand. Back Bay Mission, a UCC organization, has been serving families along the Mississippi Gulf Coast since 1922. Volunteer work crews are always welcome. The need for support does not end.
If you've ever thought about going on a mission trip, I think the Back Bay experience would be a good first time for several reasons. But it is UCC, but it's also well organized. You do receive some training. The accommodations are comfortable. It is well organized, and for a first time especially, I would recommend something that's organized and sort of permanent, and also where I felt that the people who were working there as long-term volunteers and then also actual employees, the social workers and case managers and such, really felt a deep passion for what they were doing.
And all volunteers know there are multiple winners at the end of the day.
We have a vision of what mission work is, and we're thinking the poor and the downtrodden. There's different levels of need, and we may all find ourselves at that level, but that was an eye-opening thing. It's about dignity for the people that we're serving. You know, we don't know what brought them to their situation, but there's a need, and they fit within the guidelines, and we were able to meet that need. And about not judging them or the neighborhood they live in as to whether it's worthy or not worthy, because they are a part of humanity as any of the rest of us are, and they are entitled to that dignity. that equality and that justice for whatever the reason.
My name is Zach Walgamuth. I'm the executive for UCC Disaster Ministries, a volunteer-driven program of the United Church of Christ that responds to disasters all over the world. Each year in the U.S., UCC Disaster Ministries responds to dozens of disasters, from tornadoes to earthquakes to fires to floods to hurricanes. We can't do our work without you, the volunteer. There are lots of organizations that respond to disasters. Lots of them provide early relief support, from sheltering to feeding to debris removal and cleanup work. Too often, communities and individuals feel forgotten just months after a disaster. CNN is no longer there. FEMA has completed their work, but there's still work to be done. UCC Disaster Ministries takes a different role. We work closely with communities and survivors who can't afford to hire contractors to rebuild their homes. Through this work, we provide volunteer labor to help repair and rebuild homes and to restore lives. We're not always the first on the scene, but oftentimes we're the last to leave. We need your support. We need volunteers. You don't have to be a carpenter. So many times, the most important thing that you can do as a volunteer is to sit and listen to the survivor and their story. There's hope and there's healing in the work that we do. Please join us in helping those who have suffered through disasters recover and restore hope in humanity and in Christ. Thank you.
Well, I learned the hard way how important disaster ministries are and how important it is to be prepared for anything to happen. I was living on the Gulf Coast and serving at Back Bay Mission when Hurricane Katrina came through in 2005. And over the next several years was engaged in recovery efforts. And my experience in that was that the church is the first to arrive and they are the last to leave. The church is what stands with those who are suffering and in the midst of that disaster from beginning to end. If the church is prepared, and if there are people ready to connect with those on the ground who are needing that assistance and who know what the real needs are. So when I came to Minnesota and realized we didn't have a disaster coordinator here, that was one of the things I wanted to address as quickly as I could. I want to encourage congregations to have their own preparedness plans in the event of disasters. Again, when I was at Back Bay, that was something we didn't have, but after Katrina, we had it then for any future possibilities. It's so important to have a plan so that you can communicate with your folks after a disaster, so that you're prepared ahead of time, so that you have kind of a process laid out for yourselves should the worst happen in your neighborhood. So make those plans. Think about how you might engage if there were an opportunity in Minnesota to respond to a disaster and led by our disaster coordinator. Be ready to step up and to volunteer, because I can't tell you how much that means to the people in the middle of a disaster.